We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination. Let's stop right there, because there are two thoughts in this sentence. We are not allied with any particular faith. This does not mean that you have to say anything about it. Does not mean you have to speak up in meetings and say, my name is Jim, I'm an alcoholic. We talked about this last week. I can say, my name is Jim and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and nobody can question it. Now, as a result of that, quite obviously, we have many people in our fellowship who are not alcoholics. But they're perfectly welcome. There are many people who come in the door and they have a desire to stop drinking. They're hard drinkers. But the Big Book says about these folks, they can stop or modify given the proper motivation to do so. But nevertheless, they're welcome as members. Because stop and think about the opposite. How would you set up some kind of a criteria by which you would deny membership to anybody? Do we have some sort of a mental x-ray machine that will go to the heart? Are we going to give people lie detector tests? All right, do you mean to say that you are really an alcoholic? You didn't pass the test, you have to leave. We don't have a way to do that, do we? Now, there are some people who think some kind of a written examination would fill the bill. In fact, I can think of some stuff I've seen floating around that comes out of treatment centers that will prove that you're an alcoholic or not. I question that. And then there is another technique which is being used these days, which is rather amazing. The idea being that if your life is unmanageable, you must be an alcoholic. Now, how in the world do we get to that? Good Lord, there are billions of people out there whose lives are not manageable and they're not alcoholics. That's not an indicia of anything except that we got an unmanageable life. So what? That's got nothing to do with alcoholism. It just happens to be a fact. Most people who are alcoholics don't have any way of testing this, do we? So we don't. We don't. We trust God. Believe this now. We trust God to bring the people in the door who belong here. Whether we would agree with that or not becomes totally irrelevant. And some of the people who come in that door who are not alcoholics become some of our greatest members. People who do so much for others. People who become true servants of their higher power. We just don't know when that's going to happen, and it's not for us to judge. So the only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking. We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination. Now, that is the truth, but sometimes those edges get blurred. And sometimes we like to pick up stuff which is identified with particular sects or religions. And we ought not to be doing that. If we're going to be true to ourselves and to the truth of our fellowship, we ought not to do that. If I'm going to say to a newcomer, this is not a religion, and we are not allied with any religions, and we don't practice as religions practice, this is a spiritual program based upon working a series of 12 spiritual steps which take you from a place of rebellion and defiance to a place of surrender and obedience, to a higher power of your own choice, not ours. And we don't have any set protocol here. We don't tell you how to pray. We don't recommend any particular prayers. The prayers in the Big Book are those prayers which were being used by the people who wrote it, but nobody is telling you got to use those prayers. We just don't have any religious test here. We have no catechism, and there's nobody sitting around here trying to tell you how you are to practice your relationship with your higher power. So we got to be real careful not to allow ourselves to get identified, especially in the minds of the newcomer, because the last thing we want to do is contradict ourselves. If I'm going to get somebody in front of me who's brand new and sick, sore, and wounded and suffering and looking for help and shaking and defeated and maybe even suicidal, and they're looking to me to try to give them something that will bring them some hope, and then I'm saying to them, this is not a religion. We are not affiliated with any religion. And oh, by the way, here's the prayer you have to use. You don't deal with sin. Wouldn't that be a mistake? I think anybody stop thinking about that? We don't make moral judgments in here of anybody. Now, the individual members of Alcoholics Anonymous are quite free to consider their actions as being sinful and to deal with them in the normal course of events of their own particular religious practice. But AA does not deal in sin. We deal in defects of character, we deal in insanities, and we deal in guilt, remorse, and shame arising out of those things which we have done which harmed others. We deal in the things about ourselves which block us from God, and those things are the natural God-given instincts for sex, security, and society which have been warped and perverted by fear. We're dealing here with insanity, not sin. If we look in the Big Book, we don't find sin mentioned anywhere, but what we find are defects of character and shortcomings and wrongs and a bunch of other words, all of which are synonymous, and they all mean the same thing. They all mean the effect that overwhelming fear has had upon us, upon our natural instincts. What this means is that we are totally out of control because our natural instincts are out of control, and because they operate below the level of conscious thought, we have no power over them. They're going to control us, and it is our minds, our brains, which have been totally warped out by our alcoholism and by the fears that have accompanied it. If we look at it, just boil it all down, because this is a very simple program. Pride is the godfather of all of our defects. And pride sends fear out as a hitman to kill us. So we're not going to allow ourselves to deal in concepts or protocols or catechisms or the teachings of any particular church or religion or sect or denomination. The individual may do so anytime he or she wishes. Nor do we oppose anyone. Again, look back to the Washingtonians. The Washingtonians made a grave mistake. The Washingtonians tied their society into the cause of the slavery issue. Abolition. They became abolitionists. They opposed the whole idea of slavery, and the anti-abolitionists. They took a political position as well as what might be called a moral or ethical position, but they aligned themselves with a particular political idea, a social idea, and to do that they had to be anti anybody who didn't believe that. We don't do that. We stick to our own knitting. When Bill writes, he says, "Shoemaker, stick to thy last." The last, of course, is the form, which is the form of the particular foot that we're trying to build a shoe for. Shoemaker, stick to thy last. Don't go take somebody else's. You have everything you need right here in front of you on your workbench. Stay with that. And that's what we have. We can be here in a meeting and the people come in the door who need help. And we know what we need to do to help them. And we don't have to go running around making up a whole bunch of new stuff. Everything that we need to know is right here in our book. It tells us exactly what we need to do with that newcomer. We don't have to reinvent the wheel around here. All we have to do is read the book, understand what it says, and follow it. Helpful to those who are afflicted. That's our purpose here. That's our reason for being. Think about it. Third step prayer, for example. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy love, thy will, and thy way of my life. Seventh step prayer. Take away, remove those defects of character, God, which stand in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. The instruction on page 77 is so succinct. Our real purpose, it says, is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. Look at the 12th step. Carry this message to other alcoholics. See, there's no question about why we're here. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. Let's go on now. We shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. We should like to be helpful in such cases. Inquiry by scientific method. Second edition. Figures given in this foreword describe the fellowship as it was in 1955. Since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the early text, 2s and 3s and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities. Just think about that. They were so proud and happy that there were 2s and 3s and 5s out there. People who were beginning to recover, and they were using this book. And they were using the methods which these people had developed over the last 3.5 years. And they were sober, and they were helping others to get sober. And this was their fondest hope, guys. This is what they really wanted. They believed, and they knew, and they understood that they were not there because they were super people or because they had any special merit to be sober or to have God's grace. They understood, and they wrote about it in this book, several places. They understood why they were there. They were there to carry God's message. He had chosen them. They had not chosen to be alcoholics, nor had they really chosen to adopt this method of recovery. But suddenly there it was. And they fully understood what their purpose in life, what their mission was. And so they were quite pleased that there were just this small response. You see, they envisioned this explosion. But of course, people were smiling when they said it, or even laughing out loud, because whoever heard of such a thing? And yet they were right. Let's go on. 16 years have elapsed between our first printing of this book and the presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups, whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Now, when I came in 1964, which was 9 years later, the membership in the fellowship was something over 200,000. And at that time, it was estimated there were about 12,000 groups. Now listen to this. As of today, although there's no way in the world to get an accurate count on membership in AA, but the estimated number of members is about 5 million worldwide, and over 100,000 groups, perhaps as many now as 110,000 groups. With this big book having been translated into 26 foreign languages, and AA actively now in about 140 foreign countries. It's an amazing thing. You just think this has happened from 1939 until 2002. It's just it's an exponential explosion, but there has got to be a reason for it. Now, there are a lot of people these days who ascribe to New Age AA, which kind of poo-poos the big book, you'll hear people say something like, well, it's only $1, you know, that kind of stuff. Or that was just a bunch of old white guys sitting around smoking their pipes and cigars coming up with all this stuff. But now, today, in these modern ages, we've got the modern answers to all this. And that's fine, maybe they do. I've never seen that work, but perhaps it does for an occasional person. But wait a second. If it is true, and it is true, that millions of people have recovered using this book, using these steps, without changing a single word, and without reading between the lines, but following the directions. That's got to tell us something. It's got to tell us that what we have here is something of enormous value, precious. It's God-inspired, and it always works. We can look now and we can see that this perhaps may be the truth. I don't have any way to prove it, but I believe it with all my heart. I believe the 12 steps are the last great hope of the world. I believe that the 12 steps constitute within them all of the great spiritual principles which have been taught through the ages. The big difference being that the 12 steps, as we have them in our big book, take those great spiritual principles that have always been out there, that people have paid lip service to, and have taken those principles and transmuted them into steps of action, which means simply this, that if we take the action, if we follow the directions in the big book, if we work the steps and take the action to work the steps, what we do is we take these same great spiritual principles that have been out there forever, we make them a part of us. And they become a way of life. And no longer do we have to say, yeah, I believe that that's true, but how do I do it? Aha, here's how you do it. It's right here, the 12 steps. And if that were not so, I seriously doubt if we would be able to look now and say, in these few years, over several million people have recovered from a disease which is otherwise incurable and is invariably fatal and progressive. 455 now. Groups are to be found in each of the United States and all the provinces of Canada. AA has flourishing communities in the British Isles, the Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia, and Hawaii. All told, promising beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and U.S. possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is but a beginning, only the augury of a much larger future ahead. And those friends were right. And I was delighted. Dr. Bob didn't get to live to see a whole lot of this, but Bill did. And it was a matter of enormous satisfaction to Bill that these things that they had talked about back there in the late 30s had actually happened. One of the most important things in the development of AA in the initial stages, when they had already printed the first edition of this book and it was sitting in a warehouse and nobody was buying it, couldn't find anybody to distribute it, Reader's Digest had turned down the opportunity to publish a digest of it. And Liberty Magazine had published a nice little article. But then along came Jack Alexander and the Saturday Evening Post. And if you haven't read, this is an AA pamphlet. It's available. If you haven't read this, you would be amazed what Jack Alexander was able to come up with, because when he wrote this article, I think it was in 1940, he had a very complete picture of the fellowship and the program. He really did his homework. And this article went out, and the Saturday Evening Post was in general circulation all over the country. Everybody read it, almost every home got it, just like Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post and Life, Ladies' Home Journal. Those are the magazines that everybody had. National Geographic and the Reader's Digest. So when Jack Alexander's article came out, and he was so well known and he was so credible and he wrote such a beautiful article, all of a sudden it just exploded. I mean, exploded. And these guys didn't know what to do with it. I mean, there were requests coming in from everywhere. And they went from 100 to 800 to 5,000 to 10,000. It was just amazing. And everything that they had believed might happen began to happen. And some of the wonderful stuff that was going on out there. For example, this book would go out to Cucamonga, California, and somebody in Cucamonga would read it, and he was an alcoholic or she was an alcoholic, and begin to follow the directions in the book, and son of a gun. Wow, thank you God, this worked. So he or she would tell their alcoholic friends. And once in a while somebody would say, wow, let's do that too. Before they knew it, they'd have a whole group of people in recovery. And it just spread like wildfire that way. But it came from this book. Everything came from this book. Everything. Believe it. This book is a work of inspired genius. And it is perhaps the most dense writing you'll ever pick up. I've been reading it now and studying it and teaching it for almost 38 years, and every time I do, I find something I didn't see before. And I promise you, as you and I go through this in the next year and a half, I'll be continuing to find things I never saw before. Connections that were just not obvious. They're there. There are sentences in this book which contain 3 profound thoughts, all in one sentence. If you just buzz them through, you miss them all. It's amazing. I remember they're talking about the spread of AA. A group of us went over to Russia before the wall came down. I think we were the first AAs that ever went there. We were able to get tourist permits. And while we were there, we got a chance to see some of what was going on over there. Now, alcoholism in Russia was then, and I assume it probably still is, an absolutely monster problem. We went into one factory there. They had an infirmary at that factory. And in that infirmary were hundreds upon hundreds of beds, all with sick alcoholics. And they had no way to deal with them. It was interesting also to find out that already AA was alive and well in Russia, even though God was not permitted. The Bigbook was not permitted in Russian. We weren't able to do that. But these people had the Bigbook in French and in German. And there were people actually in recovery, in spite of the fact that they were then living in a totalitarian regime which did not permit the existence of God. And so when we saw that, we knew what was going to happen sooner or later. And of course, when the wall came down and Gladnos came along, and the Bigbook was translated into Russian, and now it's just an explosion over there. Thank you, God, for that too. All our brothers and sisters over there now have a chance, same chance that we have. Let's go down now on page 15 again, last partial paragraph. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June of 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. It's interesting, isn't it, that we measure the existence of AA not from Bill's recovery in the latter part of 1934, but we measure it from the time that he and Dr. Bob got together and Dr. Bob got sober. And our Founders Day is in June rather than in November. And the reason for this is that people decided that until at least one more person got sober, we couldn't say that it was anything more than a gleam in Bill's eye. In any event, we measure the existence of the fellowship from that date that Bill and Bob got together and Bob got sober. Going on, 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. Now that's an oversimplification, of course, of what really happened. When we read Bill's story, we'll be getting there one of these days. Trust me, we will. We're going to find that it was much more than that. That Bill, in fact, did have some kind of an epiphany, a massive spiritual experience. But prior to that time, he had gone through a whole learning process with the help of his friend Abby. And not only that, but he had in fact worked most of the steps that we now call the 12 steps. And we'll see that too. So there was a good deal more to Bill's recovery than the fact that he had this spiritual experience. What happened with that was that the obsession to drink alcohol was removed from him, and according to his own reports, it never came back. Bill had the spiritual experience, but his mind had been opened up to this by virtue of the fact, for example, that his friend Ebby had convinced him that it was only necessary for him to form his own conception of God, that it was not necessary for him to accept anyone else's conception. And moreover, Ebby had convinced him that the only requirement was that he be willing to believe that there just might be a power out there greater than himself. Now those two things came along at a time just before Bill went into the hospital for the last time. And furthermore, even though he had been relieved of his obsession to drink alcohol, something more had to happen because that was not going to last. What had to happen was that he had to come to a place where he understood that it was going to be necessary for him to carry this message to others. In other words, that he would not be able to keep the grace he had been given if he was not willing to give it away. And that inspiration came to him in the last days in his hospital bed before he went home. But for that, I think we talked about this first time we got together, but for that we probably wouldn't be here. In fact, I'm sure we wouldn't. It was that inspiration which led directly to the fact that Bill began the process of trying to get others to follow his lead, to walk where he had walked, to recover as he had recovered. And it was precisely that which led him on that day in Akron to go to Dr. Bob rather than going and having a drink. I think that the story of Bill and Bob getting together is one of the truly great stories. Just think about it for a second. Maybe it seems a bit mundane to you, but I beg of you, don't think of it that way. Think of it as a bloody miracle. Because had this not happened, where would we be? Had this not happened, you see, it's true that the fellowship really started there in June of 1935 when these two guys got together finally. Had that not happened, where would we be? Where would there, and so it's absolutely incredible, amazing thing, a miracle. And I'm convinced also that this was what God wanted, that He brought these guys together, that He inspired Bill to do what he did, rather than to get drunk that night, to find somebody, and he was led directly to Dr. Bob. Let's see how that happened. Top of page 16 now, XVI. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who
is now counted no less than a medical saint by the AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. Dr. Silkworth, and we're going to get into Silkworth in some detail when we get to his opinion, because it's a masterwork. A masterwork. He ought to have had the Nobel Prize in Medicine for 1939. It's a travesty he didn't have it. He did something that had never been done before, and later, about 8 years later, American Medical Association woke up to the fact that he was right. He was right. You and I have a disease, and they had to finally admit it. But he put his whole reputation on the line to express what he expressed in that doctor's opinion. We can't pass over that saying, oh, well, it's just some little old doctor out there shooting off his mouth. He had probably the greatest credibility of anybody in the United States in the time he wrote that, and he risked that entire credibility by writing what he wrote. Because he was saying, you and I are not bad people. We're not people without willpower. We are not people who need to be consigned to sanitariums and locked away. He's saying we're sick people. Sick people. And he identified the illness. And he showed us how it worked and why it worked and how we could recover. He showed us the way. Let's go on now. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Now, this fluffs over something else, which we ought to know about, because it's another watershed event that was a key to the fellowship ever coming to be. He's talking about that Bill had been greatly helped by Dr. Silkworth. Well, here's the way that really happened. You see, Bill had been in the town's hospital for 2 prior treatments before he went in that last time, never to return. The second time that Bill was in town's hospital, that was when Dr. Silkworth had told him, Bill, you are an incurable alcoholic. We can't help you. If you don't stop drinking, you're going to be dead within a year. And Lois is sitting right there too. Now Bill took that to heart. For several months he didn't drink, but then we know what happened, because he was drunk as a skunk when Evie came to visit him that night in November of 1934. But Bill had been going back over to town's hospital in the next 6 months, and he was trying to work with some of the helpless, hopeless wrecks that Dr. Silkworth had back in his back room that he couldn't help. But nobody was getting sober. So here's what happened. Bill went to Silkworth and he said, I don't understand it, Doc. He said, I'm working with these people, I'm showing them what I did to recover, and nobody is taking me up on it. I can't get anybody sober. And Silkworth said, wait a second, Bill. Let me tell you what you're doing wrong. He said, you can't walk up to these people and say, buddy, you look like you're an alcoholic. Get on your knees and start praying. So that ain't going to work. So also it's not going to work if they listen to you and you spend the time telling them about your bright light experience. They're not going to be interested in your epiphany. Not very many of them are going to even. Remember when you were in here the second time and I told you that you had a disease which was incurable, and that I couldn't help you, and if you didn't stop drinking within a year, you'd be dead. I said, you got to tell them. They have to understand what's wrong with them. He said, if you don't tell them what's wrong with them, how are they ever going to decide that there's anything urgent about all of this? He said, I know that part of your recovery was triggered by the fact that I had told you that, and so when your friend Ebby came to talk to you, you were ready to listen. So you got to soften him up. So the other thing you got to do is stay off of this bright light experience. Tell him how you drank. Tell him what happened to you when you drank. Tell him how you tried to stop drinking and couldn't. Tell him how your life went all to pieces. And if they're still interested, after you've told them what's wrong with them and what happened with you, then you tell them how you recovered. So that's what Bill carried with him when he went to Akron. Let's read about that. The first full paragraph on 16. Prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded only in keeping sober himself. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. Now here's what really happened. Bill came back from getting slam dunked in a business thing when he was about broke, and he'd counted on that as to carry him through. He came back to Mayflower Hotel. And he walked in, and over to the right was, if you go there, somebody was just there. I don't know if he went to the hotel or not, but off the right is the bar room, and he could hear everybody in there having a hell of a good time. And they were all laughing, and the glasses were clinking, and everybody it was just, as Bill said, a gay crowd. And so, and he was despondent, and he really wanted to go in there and just dump it all right there. But in front of him was a directory of churches, still there, by the way. If you go to the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, you'll see that same directory there. Different names on it. And there was the name of a minister who was the minister of the local Oxford group. Now, Bill had been going to meetings with the Oxford group, and when he saw this guy's name, he said, wow, there's his phone number, let me call him and see what happens. The guy was there. The guy knew Henrietta Sieberling, the heiress to the Sieberling tire fortune, and she knew Dr. Bob. And so, from that total place of desperation where he was ready to drink, the inspiration came right back to him. Work with somebody else, find somebody to work with. That's the only thing that's going to keep you sober. And that's what he did. Let's go on page 16 again, the last partial paragraph. This physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to solve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. By the way, Dr. Bob had already tried the Oxfordians. They didn't work very well for him. A lot of people have speculated that he perhaps had not yet reached his bottom. I don't know. All I know is, and all we know is, that when Bill sat down and talked to him, a whole different thing took place. And that thing was that Dr. Bob later reported that Bill was the first person who ever talked to him who knew what he was talking about when it came to alcohol. And so he hadn't listened to him. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. You see, this is what we were sharing a little bit ahead of time here. Dr. Silkworth's conversation with Bill about how to go about approaching a newcomer is what Bill carried with him to Akron and applied it right here with Dr. Bob, and that's what turned Dr. Bob around. Here's a medical guy, never heard of such a thing. Well, of course he hadn't. The medical profession at that time rejected this silly notion that alcoholics had a disease. They were bad people or they were weak people. They were clowns. They were the laughing stock of the community. If they were women, you kept them locked away as best you could. And at some point, if they got too bad and a threat to themselves and others, you took them to a court, a special court, where they would determine their sanity or insanity. And if they were determined to be insane, they were locked away. And this could very often be forever, the rest of their lives. And so the medical profession, of which Dr. Bob was a quite eminent member, had never heard of this. But when Bill told this to Dr. Bob, he, because he had experienced it, could understand this business of an allergy, this business of that first drink triggering a reaction, a phenomenon of craving, which is purely physical in the sense that it was the body responding to this substance, alcohol, because Dr. Bob had experienced that. And then when Bill also shared with him that the rest of this disease was centered in the mind, and that it was a form of insanity, and that it was obsession and compulsion in the nth degree, and that all of these things mixed together constituted the disease, an incurable, fatal, progressive illness. And Dr. Bob could identify with that. He saw that that was right, because he had lived it. Going on, he sobered up, Dr. Bob sobered up, never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. By the way, does anybody remember Dr. Bob's last message to AA?
Keep it simple.
Yeah, he said keep it simple, and the last thing he said was what AA is all about. And we got to remember this. What AA is all about, he said, is love and service. Love and service. Here was a guy who was probably the champion 12-stepper of all time. He is reputed to have worked with at least 5,000 alcoholics. And stop and think about that from 1939 to 1950. Well, when did he start? Well, we're going to read about that. The first person he was working with, he worked with Bill. Let's see how that came out. Going down to the bottom of the page, this seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Now, Bill had already come to that conclusion, and he wrote about in his story. The way he put it is this: if an alcoholic failed to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain low spots ahead, and he would drink again. And that was true when he wrote it in 1939, and it is just as true today. It also, it also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Please notice what they're talking about here. They're talking about one-on-one. One-on-one. And when we look at the 7th chapter, we're going to find the only definition of sponsorship the Big Book has is one line: both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. Two people walking together and growing together spiritually. So at the very bottom of all of this is the concept, which is the truth of everything that we have to do here, that one of us working with another one of us is the way this program is eventually transmitted from one to another. That's the way it grows. Now we can talk here, and we can say, yeah, that sounds good, and maybe we begin to get some reason to dig into the big book a little bit more, maybe get a little busier on the steps, or to work a little harder with other people, which of course we must do. But ultimately, what is going to grow this fellowship and bring sobriety to our fellow sufferers is each of us working one-on-one with others. And as much as we love our meetings, as much as we love sitting around and having the camaraderie and the fellowship and the friendship and all of that, ultimately it boils back down to one alcoholic working with another. That's the way it started, and that's the way it still is. Let's go on page Romans 17, XVII. Hence the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. He never had another drink. Boy, that's a shorthand way of talking about what really happened there. Oh man, this AA number 3 is Bill Dotson, and Bill is AA number 3 in the back of the book. And Bill was a real hard case. He was a lawyer. He'd been very successful in the Akron area. But Bill was a real bad alcoholic, and when he got drunk, he got violent. So when Bill and Bob went over to the hospital and were looking around for some hard case that they could work on, here was one. They had him tied down. He'd already busted up a couple of nurses, and this guy was really something else. So what happened was that Bill and Bob went in there and they talked to Bill Dodson. They talked to him one day and they told him about themselves, and they told him what happened with them, and told him about the disease, and they told him how they were recovering. And he wasn't buying it, and he was saying, well, that's okay for you guys, but I got to tell you, I'm hopeless. There's no way, I've tried everything, he said, nothing works. Here, they won't even take the straps off my ankles and my wrists because they're afraid I'm going to hurt somebody. They said, Bill and Bob said, we don't care. Doesn't scare us any. You're not near as bad as some we've seen. The next day they came back and they talked to him again. And they tried to get him to pray a little bit with him. And that night, Bill Dodson's wife came to visit him, and something happened with him. And he said to his wife, you know, these guys have been coming in and talking to me, and I think they may be right. He said, I think I'm going to try what they have. I believe I'm going to just try this. And when Bill and Bob came back the next day, he was ready. He was ready. It was the grace of God. And Bill got up out of that bed and he walked away a free man, and he never drank again. Now, at this point, Bill and Bob, you can imagine how they felt, can't you? Boy, this stuff really does work. Wow, this works. It isn't just you and me. We can take this message out to any alcoholic, and it'll work. So they were really, really ready to go then. They understood that they really, in fact, had something. Think about it, only 3 people in recovery, and at that point they knew that they had something that really worked. The proof was in the pudding. Today we have a whole bunch of people running around who still doubt it. Amazing. Okay. We're going on now on page 17. First full paragraph. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. See, Bill was living with Bob and Ann at their house. And I don't know, I think he was kind of afraid to go home because Lois was going to have his head on a basket. because he'd blown his money and he'd blown his business deal. But anyway, he hung out around Akron there, and he and Bob went out and they got a few more people, along with Bill Dodson was helping them. So there were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. Because here were just a bunch of people getting together, and believe me, it was the families. They were meeting in each other's homes. The wives were involved. Everybody was involved. They knew it was they'd figured out by that time this is a family disease. They weren't hiding out from anybody. Dr. Bob had gone around town in his old Model A Ford, making amends all over town. And it worked. Going on, second paragraph. A second small group promptly took shape in New York, to be followed in 1937 by the start of a third at Cleveland. Actually, what happened, Cleveland's only about, 25 or 30 miles up the road from Akron. So the people in Akron kind of migrated up there and began working with people in Cleveland. That's a good thing they did, because shortly after, the Cleveland Plain Dealer got hold of what was going on. They ran some great articles about AA, and that really jump-started the Cleveland group. I think they went from about 15 members to like 50 almost overnight. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York, who were trying to form groups in other cities. Now, you see, a lot of people don't understand when they say we are more than 100 men and women. They're only talking about the people who were New York, Akron, and Cleveland. But they were meeting constantly with people who lived in other places. And some of these folks are going out and starting their own little groups, 2s and 3s and 5s here and there. So when they talk about hundreds, they didn't know for sure how many there were out there, because there was no formal way of checking on it. But they did know that AA was spreading by word of mouth. By 1937, late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. They really, really came to understand that they had something priceless and precious, that it was working. And if they hadn't believed it before, all but 1 or 2 of their membership had come to believe that what they had was God-inspired, that it was an entirely spiritual program, that it was a way of going from a place of spiritual bankruptcy, from a place of denial and rebellion and defiance, to a place of surrender and obedience. They came to understand that. And so the new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. And it was at this time, then in late 1937, that they got together and decided that it would be a good idea to try to find some way to get the message out. Because they realized that this word of mouth was way too slow, and it was not effective in the sense of reaching out to the millions of alcoholics out there. So they began to bandy about the idea of writing a book. My understanding is that it was early in 1938 when they finally made a decision to write the book. Let's see what it says here on page 17, last full paragraph. It was now time, the struggling groups thought, to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The flying blind period ended and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. Now, remember what happened there with the writing of the book. Bill was asked to write it, of course, and being the kind of guy he wasn't about to say no. So he wrote the entire Big Book from his own perspective. And there, if you go to Akron, you can purchase there, I think I showed you my copy, of the original manuscript, which was printed on lithograph or multilith, and sold for $3.50. After that had been produced, however, the editorial committee got hold of that and made some pretty substantial changes before it went to the printers to print the first edition, first printing of the Big Book. The primary change that was made was to go from a place where Bill, was a power driver and egoist, and he had to constantly battle with that. And so he was, in his version of the book, he was telling us what to do. You got to do this, and you got to do that, or else. And they said, no, Bill, that's not what we have in mind at all. We want to tell our story. We want to tell how we recovered. We want people to be able to pick up this book and say, this is real. This is the truth. These are people who are telling us what happened to them. Remember Dr. Silkworth's little letter that he wrote first? He said, you can believe anything these men say about themselves. And that's a pretty great statement to be made. Wouldn't you love to have people be able to say that about you? The last two lines. With the appearance of the new book, a great deal began. With the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval. By the way, there's a collection of Harry Emerson Fosdick's sermons, which were actually delivered in his church back in the 20s and early 30s. And if you read those sermons, it's amazing how parallel they are to the Big Book. And that collection of his sermons is around. I don't know if it's still in print, but copies are available. And so Harry Emerson Fosdick reviewed this book with approval. And you can see why. When you read his sermons, you can see that these guys were talking about the same thing he believed and the same thing he preached. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Owsler, then editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics and God. Now, Liberty magazine has been out of circulation for a long, long time. But Liberty magazine was in general circulation. It was not as popular as Saturday Evening Post or the Reader's Digest or Life, but certainly it was. There were millions of copies out there every week. It was a weekly magazine, and so this was the first article that was out there, and a lot of people read it. And because of that, it says here now. Let's go to the fourth line on 18. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. new groups started up, and it was found, to the astonishment of everyone, that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. Remember that all of this started in June of 1935, so we're looking at just a little over 4 years. Going on now, they had gone out and they had contacted John D. Rockefeller because he, of course, had a ton of money, and they figured they could work him for some dough. So, in the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, to which he invited AA members to tell their stories. And they were delighted. These guys had visions of lollipops dancing in their heads. I mean, they could see huge bags of money just getting thrown at them. Because after all, these people that Rockefeller was inviting to this dinner, and these were the people who had 40 oil wells in their backyard. I mean, they were sitting there going like this, watching those things go up and down, pumping out all that money for them. Or they owned the steel companies or the railroads. And these were the people that invited to this dinner. Now, obviously, it would be easy for them to cough up $1 million or $2 million, for a worthy cause, like our friends. These guys figured that they were recovering alcoholics, for God's sakes, and this is one of the great problems of the world, is alcoholism. So obviously, these rich guys would be just happy to contribute. So they went and told their stories, and the news of this got on the world wires. Inquiries poured in again, and many people went to bookstores to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, what Bill doesn't say here, when he wrote this forward, is that Rockefeller turned him down. And what he said to him was, here's $5,000, that's all you're going to get. Because the only way that your outfit is going to survive is if you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. You need to be self-supporting through your own efforts. And boy, oh boy, you can imagine the long faces these guys were building. They already had plans for hospitals to be built. They were all going to be on the board of directors, take a good salary and all that. And he said, that's all you get, fella, the $5,000. Go out now and sin no more, Oh man, I could just imagine that bunch of power drivers. They'd been sitting around smoking their stogies, and figuring out this was going to be really a coup. And some of them, really figured what they had was so good that it was going to just simply swamp the world. But you see what happens here, guys, it's so obvious that you take any group of junks, recovering junks, and throw a little money that way, and they go ape. And everybody's got a different idea about how to spend it, and their idea is the only one that's worth considering. It tears groups apart. That's why we have to stay poor. I'm glad to see all of you paupers in here. This is good. We just stay poor, guys. You can always tell an AA meeting with all the drunk mobiles outside. But that's the way it's supposed to be. By March 1941, the membership was shot up to 2,000. Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post and placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public that Alcoholics in Need of Help really deluged us. That's this article right here. It is reproduced in pamphlet form. It's approved AA literature, and it's an amazing piece of work. Because Jack Alexander had to have really spent some time getting his facts straight. When you read this article that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, you're going to find that you can say yes to it all the way through. He knew what he was talking about. Now, if anybody hasn't seen this and would like to borrow it and pass it around among their friends, you can come and get it after the meeting. Saturday Evening Post was a magazine which was in general circulation, was in almost every home. The famous Norman Rockwell covers, you've seen his paintings. It was if you could afford it, you got it. And I think they sold for a nickel then, something like that, a nickel or a dime, not more than that. But this article in the Saturday Evening Post then was out there and was read by millions. And so as soon as that article appeared, then our friends were deluged. That's what it says. Close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. The mushrooming process was in full swing. AA had become a national institution. Now I remember hearing about AA when I was in junior high school, because I had a grandfather who needed this fellowship badly. But in accordance with the old traditions, my folks kept him pretty well locked up in his bedroom. They let him come out once in a while to tend the Victory Garden, but he had to stay on the property. But then every once in a while he'd break loose. It was about 2 miles to the nearest liquor store, and he wasn't a young guy anymore. But man, he'd somehow find a way to hobble over to that liquor store and hobble back. You know how we are. So I remember the talk about AA was around my house even then. Our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. The test that it faced was this: could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and in every group. But out of this frightening and at first disrupting experience, the conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. Now, this forward to the second edition, of course, was written after the adoption in 1950 of the 12 traditions. And so this next paragraph is going to give us a short synopsis of the 12 traditions. And it's well worth our considering because it kind of puts everything in perspective. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, so we had to evolve principles by which AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. I want you to notice that this is the first place in the Bigbook where the word principles is used to describe the steps. But we find this happening over and over again, because in fact the principles are the steps and the steps are the principles, and there are no principles behind principles. And so they discovered the principles to individually survive, and then they needed to discover the principles which would allow the fellowship and the groups to survive. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society. Well, they had tried that, but it didn't work. And by 1945 and 46, when Bill was actually writing the traditions out, it had become crystal clear that we didn't have any way of deciding logically or rationally who should belong and who shouldn't. They used to have all kinds of membership requirements. I believe maybe this is apocryphal, but I've been told that one of the groups had you had to submit your financial statement. They weren't going to allow any bums off street to join their people just like them. It turned out that what really happened was that among the various groups, the membership requirements were so restrictive. If you added them all together and put them in one lump sum, none of the original 100 could have been a member of any group. And so they realized that that wasn't going to work. So it boiled down to a simple statement that you're a member, in effect, when you say you are, that the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And because that's so, we have avoided all kinds of grief, all kinds of difficulties that would have ensued had we were trying to find some way to limit our membership only to those who had proven themselves to be real alcoholics. Now, as a result of that, guys, this is not put knock on anybody, it's just a fact, that there are lots of folks who come in and become members of our society and of our groups who are not alcoholics. But they have a desire to stop drinking, and that's all we require. And because that is so, many of these folks don't need to work the steps or read the big book. And they have a wonderful time being members of the groups and having the fellowship, and they stick around for years and years and years and years. And they eventually establish themselves with a lot of stature. And yet, these are folks who will say, I didn't have to work steps. I don't think I'd probably glance at the big book, but I just don't drink and I go to meetings. And so we need to be careful when we hear that and consider the source. If you're a real alcoholic like I am, you're powerless over alcohol, which means quite simply that there is no human solution for your problem. And just not drinking is something you can't do. You can't not drink, or if you could, you wouldn't have to be here. And so we need to be a little careful of where some of this stuff is coming from. And of course, it's very beguiling, isn't it? Because all of us would like to have an easier, softer way if we could. And when someone tells us, oh, I didn't work steps, I didn't get around steps till I was here for 10 years and that kind of stuff. Well, that's fine. And we say, hurrah for you, God bless you, that's wonderful. For me, I got to pick up this big book and read what it says and follow the directions, because I'm convinced that if I don't, I fit into the pattern of the sick, sore, and wounded alcoholic who is going to die if I don't stop drinking. So then we go on. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman should be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but not govern. Now, that's a really interesting concept, isn't it? You name any other society where you elect people to be your leaders, but you don't let them do anything about it. You give them absolutely no power. Now, of course, if you've been around groups for a while, you realize that there are certain individuals who, once having been elected as a trusted servant, decide that they don't like this servant one bit at all. They're going to take over, and sometimes they're effectively able to do that for a while. But the tradition is so important to remember that we don't have anybody here who's policing us. We have no committees which lay down the rules. Well, no, that's not entirely true. There are groups which do that. There's a group in South Day that has a steering committee that meets once a month, and this steering committee makes up all kinds of rules, and they've got bylaws and all this stuff. And I think they're screwy myself. But they seem to like it. The problem is that once you get some power, you got to defend your power base, don't you? You ever walk into a group and have somebody come up and say, are you a member now? Yes. Well, let me tell you, we got elections coming up next week, and my candidate is so-and-so. Man, electioneering in AA. You have to ask yourself, why would you go to trouble of making sure that somebody was elected as a trusted servant when after they're elected they have no power to do anything? That doesn't make sense, does it? And but that's the way we do, and everybody who looks at us says, this is crazy. There's no outfit in the world can function this way. You gotta have rules and regulations, somebody to enforce them, somebody to make up new rules and regulations. Somebody's in charge, somebody bangs the gavel and makes sure that it keeps everybody in order. I mean, if you're gonna conduct a meeting with Robert's Rules of Order, you need a parliamentarian, right? I know groups that have a parliamentarian, and they will spend half of a business meeting arguing over points of parliamentary law. Whether a motion to table precedes a motion calling for the question, and then the parliamentarian has to get out Robert's Rules of Order and thumb through this well-thumbed book and decide the question. In the meantime, all the important stuff is just forgotten. Amazing what we are. You know, we're such power drivers. It's so hard to leave your ego behind, isn't it?